In the vast darkness between stars, where even light takes centuries to travel from one point to another, there exists a peculiar phenomenon that has puzzled xenobiologists and astrophysicists across 1,000 worlds. Ships don't just get lost in space, they get found. Not by rescue fleets or military patrols, but by something far more improbable, a single human who decided that the universe was too big a place for anyone to be alone. What started as one man's guilt over a promise broken has become something that defies every law of economics, politics, and common sense. A place where the galaxy's most desperate, most hunted, and most forgotten souls wash up like debris on a cosmic shore, where species that have warred for millennia sit across the same dinner table, where technology that shouldn't exist repairs ships that were considered beyond salvation. They call it Haven's Rest, though most visitors never learn the real reason for the name. They don't know about the promise that built it, the guilt that powers it, or the man who refuses to let the universe stay broken on his watch. They only know that when everything else has failed, when their ships are dying and their people are scattered across the void. The question isn't how Marcus Chen built the impossible. The question is why the rest of the galaxy is so afraid of what he's proven. That sometimes the best way to fix a broken universe is one small kindness at a time. Marcus Chen had been drifting in the Kepler 442 system for 3 days when the distress beacon reached his ship. The signal was weak, barely registering on his sensors, and encoded in a frequency he didn't recognize. Most salvage operators would have ignored it. Dead ships meant good salvage, and live crews meant complications. Marcus had learned to ignore a lot of things during his 15 years working the Outer Rim trade routes, but this signal was different. It wasn't the standard automated distress call that most ships broadcast when their systems failed. This was someone manually keying a transmitter, tapping out the same desperate message in what his computer identified as a pre-contact Terran code, Morse code. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. SOS. Someone out there knew humans existed, knew their old communication methods, and was specifically calling for help. Marcus Chen had never been able to ignore a call for help, which was exactly why he was out here in the first place, alone in a modified cargo hauler, instead of back on Terra Nova with his wife and daughter. He followed the signal for 6 hours through the asteroid field that ringed Kepler 442b, his ship's hull groaning under the stress of constant course corrections. The rocks here were dense with rare metals, which explained why someone might be foolish enough to navigate through them. It also explained why his sensors were having trouble getting a clear lock on the source. When he finally found the ship, Marcus understood why the signal had been so weak. The vessel was trapped inside a massive asteroid, its hull partially embedded in the rock face. The ship's design was unlike anything in his databases. Sleek curves instead of the angular efficiency favored by most spacefaring species, with what looked like organic components grown rather than manufactured. The SOS signal was coming from a small antenna that had been rigged to extend through a crack in the asteroid. Someone was alive in there, and they were creative enough to jury-rig a transmitter from whatever materials they had available. Marcus appreciated creative problem-solving. His ship, the Wanderer's Rest, wasn't equipped for major rescue operations. It was a Titan-class heavy hauler that he'd modified for long-range salvage work, with expanded life support, additional storage, and a workshop that took up half the cargo bay. The ship was built for durability, not heroics. But Marcus had learned to make do with what he had. He started by mapping the asteroid's composition, looking for weak points where he could safely attach mining charges. The rock was mostly iron and nickel, with veins of what his scanners identified as trilithium, a rare element used in faster-than-light drives, valuable but also highly unstable when exposed to certain energy frequencies. The trapped ship was pressed against one of the largest trilithium veins. One wrong move with the mining charges and the entire asteroid would become a very expensive firework. Marcus would have to extract the ship without using explosives, which meant doing it the hard way. He suited up and took one of his maintenance drones outside to get a closer look at the situation. The trapped vessel was wedged tight, with roughly 30 meters of asteroid material holding it in place. The The ship's hull showed evidence of impact damage, but the metal was still intact. Whatever species had built this ship, they understood structural engineering. Marcus spent 2 hours studying the problem from every angle before he came up with a plan. It wasn't elegant, but it would work. He would use his ship's industrial fabricator to create a series of shaped charges, not to blast through the rock, but to create controlled fractures that would allow the asteroid to break apart along natural stress lines. Then he could use his ship's tractor beam to pull the pieces away from the trapped vessel. The process took 14 hours. Marcus worked methodically, placing each charge with the precision of a surgeon. One mistake would kill whoever was trapped inside that ship and probably destroy both vessels in the process. He'd made too many mistakes already in his life. He wasn't going to make another one. When the last piece of asteroid debris drifted clear, the alien ship hung free in space, its hull scarred but intact. Marcus was preparing to extend his ship's docking tube when the rescued vessel's engine suddenly flared to life. For a moment, he thought they were going to run, a not uncommon response from species who had bad experiences with human contact. Instead, the ship moved into a parallel position alongside the Wanderer's Rest. A few minutes later, Marcus received a transmission on standard galactic frequencies. "Unknown vessel, this is Captain Zaratel of the Bright Current. We owe you a debt that cannot be measured. May we come aboard to properly express our gratitude?" The voice was musical, with the complex harmonics that marked it as melodian. Marcus had encountered their species a few times during his trading days, peaceful explorers who valued art and philosophy above material wealth. They were also known for their strict codes of honor regarding debts and obligations. "Wanderer's Rest to Bright Current," Marcus replied. "You don't owe me anything, Captain. Just helping out a fellow spacer. But you're welcome aboard if you want to check your ship's systems before you head out." There was a long pause before Zarathel responded. "We would be honored to accept your hospitality, Wanderer's Rest. Though I must warn you, our situation is more complicated than a simple rescue." Marcus sealed his suit and headed for the airlock, wondering what he was getting himself into. In his experience, when alien captains warned him that things were complicated, it usually meant they were about to become much more complicated. The Melodian captain was tall and graceful with the iridescent skin that her species was known for. With Trust Teddy, she was accompanied by what looked like her entire crew. 3 other Melodians and 2 beings Marcus didn't recognize. One appeared to be some kind of crystalline entity, while the other was covered in what looked like metallic feathers. "I am Captain Zaratel," she said, offering the formal bow that served as a greeting among her people. "This is my crew: Engineer Kithara, Navigator Solian, Communications Specialist Darmoth, Christek of the 5th Resonance, and Wing Singer Hakathle." Marcus returned the bow as best he could. "Marcus Chen, owner and operator of this bucket. Welcome aboard." Zarathel's expression grew serious. "Marcus Chen, what I am about to tell you may place you in significant danger. We are not merely travelers who suffered an accident. We are refugees, fleeing from forces that have declared us enemies of the state." "What state?" Marcus asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "The hegemony," Christek said, his voice resonating through the ship's hull like a struck bell. "They have issued termination warrants for all of us. The Terran hegemony." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. His former employers had a reputation for efficiency when it came to dealing with problems, and they considered most non-human species to be problems by definition. If these people were fleeing from the hegemony, helping them could be considered an act of treason. Marcus looked at the small group of aliens standing in his cargo bay. They were obviously exhausted, probably hadn't eaten properly in days, and were clearly afraid. Christek's crystalline structure showed stress fractures that suggested he was running on reserve energy. Wing Singer Hakathale's metallic feathers were dull and brittle-looking. Even the Melodians, usually known for their composed demeanor, showed signs of strain.
"How long have you been running?"
Marcus asked. 6 months, Zarathel admitted. We were part of a research expedition studying pre-contact civilizations in the Outer Rim territories. We discovered evidence of hegemony violations of the Galactic Accords, illegal occupation of protected worlds, forced relocation of primitive species, destruction of archaeological sites. When we tried to report our findings to the Council, we were branded as terrorists. Marcus nodded slowly. It sounded like typical hegemony operation. Expand first, worry about legality later. Anyone who got in the way was either recruited or eliminated. And now you're stuck out here with nowhere to go. Our ship is damaged, Engineer Kithara said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was softer than her captain's, with the kind of weariness that came from too many sleepless hours keeping broken systems running. The trilithium veins in that asteroid interfered with our quantum resonance chamber. We can travel at sublight speed, but we cannot achieve faster than light velocity. Without FTL, they were trapped in this system. The nearest inhabited world was 47 light-years away. Even if they could maintain maximum sublight speed, the journey would take them over a century. They would all be dead long before they reached safety. Marcus looked at the group again. Teddy. 6 beings from 4 different species united only by their desire to do the right thing and their classification as enemies of humanity's most powerful political entity. If he helped them, he would become a fugitive himself. If he didn't, they would die slowly in the cold emptiness between stars. It wasn't really a choice at all. Let's take a look at your ship, Marcus said. See what we can do about getting you moving again. The next few hours were spent crawling through the Bright Currents engineering sections with Kithara, examining the damage to their exotic propulsion system, equipment he'd originally purchased for salvage work, but which he gradually expanded and upgraded until it rivaled some planetary facilities. Tools and fabrication equipment worth more than most ships, all of it sitting unused while he drifted between systems, looking for something he could never name. I have an idea, Marcus said finally. It's completely insane, but it might work. Zaratel materialized on the bridge, her curiosity overcoming her diplomatic training. What kind of idea? What if we didn't fix your ship here? Marcus said. What if we moved your ship somewhere safe, where we'd have time to make proper repairs? The nearest safe harbor is 47 light-years away, Kristek pointed out, his crystalline form chiming with skepticism. We have already established that our ship cannot achieve faster-than-light travel. But mine can, Marcus said. The Wanderer's Rest has military-grade engines and structural reinforcement. She can carry a lot more than cargo if she has to. The alien stared at him in silence for several seconds before Zarathel found her voice. You are suggesting that you tow our ship for 47 light-years? Actually, I was thinking of somewhere a little closer, Marcus said. There's an uninhabited system about 15 light-years from here. Rocky planets, asteroid fields, plenty of raw materials. No strategic value, so the hegemony doesn't patrol it. We could set up a temporary base there. Take our time fixing your ship properly. Wing singer Hakathlay spoke for the first time, her voice like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. This human proposes to exile himself from his own species to help strangers. Why would he do such a thing? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, thinking about promises broken and chances lost. Because someone once asked me to help people, and I said I would. I've been looking for a way to keep that promise for a long time. And if the hegemony finds us? Zarathel asked. Marcus shrugged. Then we deal with that when it happens. But in the meantime, you'll be alive, and that's gotta count for something. The Melodian captain exchanged glances with her crew, conducting one of the rapid harmonic conversations that her species used for private communication. After several minutes of musical discussion, she turned back to Marcus. Marcus Chen of the Wanderer's Rest, she said formally. On behalf of my crew and my people, I accept your offer. Though I must warn you, by helping us, you are making yourself an enemy of the hegemony. There will be no going back. I figured as much, Marcus said. Guess that makes us all refugees together." As he began the complex process of rigging a tow system between the two ships, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years: purpose. For the first time since Sarah's death, he was moving towards something instead of running away from it. He was keeping his promise, even if it was 8 years late. The system he'd chosen for their temporary sanctuary was designated NGC 4472 in the star charts, a red dwarf with 7 rocky planets and an asteroid belt that contained every element on the periodic table. It wasn't much to look at, but it was isolated, defensible, and rich in the materials they would need. Most importantly, it was far enough from any major shipping lane that they would have time to work without interruption. Time to fix the Bright Current's engines. Time to figure out what to do next. Time to build something better than what they were running from. Marcus didn't know it yet, but he had just chosen the site for something that would become legend throughout the galaxy. A place where the lost would find shelter, where the broken would be made whole, where the galaxy's most unlikely alliance would be forged. One act of kindness at a time. He had just chosen the location for Haven's Rest, the journey to NGC. 4472 took 18 days, with the Bright Current secured beneath the Wanderer's Rest like a metallic parasite. Marcus had never attempted to tow another ship through hyperspace before, and the stress readings on his hull made him nervous every time he checked them. But the improvised coupling held, and both ships emerged intact in the red dwarf system that would become their new home. The third planet from the star was a Mars-like world with a thin atmosphere and no signs of life. Perfect for their needs. Close enough to the asteroid belt for mining operations, but far enough from the system's edge that any approaching ships would be detected hours before arrival. Marcus set them down on a flat plain near what appeared to be an ancient impact crater, the kind of natural formation that would provide both shelter and raw materials. "Welcome to paradise," Marcus announced as he powered down the engines. Through the viewports, the landscape looked like something from a disaster movie. Red sand, jagged rocks, and a sky the color of dried blood. "It is magnificent," Zaratel said, and Marcus realized she wasn't being sarcastic. Melodians appreciated harsh beauty in ways that humans often missed. "This world has character. It has survived great trauma and endured." Marcus hadn't thought of it that way, but he supposed she was right. The planet showed evidence of massive bombardment at some point in its history, probably during the early formation of the system. But it had survived, and now it was offering sanctuary to another group of survivors. The first week was spent establishing basic infrastructure. Marcus used his fabrication equipment to create atmospheric processors and power generators, while Kithara worked on setting up a temporary workshop inside the crater. The other aliens contributed according to their abilities. Christek provided computational power for the engineering calculations. Wing-singer Hakatala used her natural electromagnetic sensitivity to map mineral deposits, and the remaining Melodians handled logistics and resource management. It was during this period that Marcus began to understand what made this group special. They weren't just refugees fleeing persecution. They were scientists, researchers, and explorers who had dedicated their lives to understanding the universe. Their ship's databanks contained detailed studies of dozens of pre-contact civilizations, archaeological surveys of ancient sites, and xenobiological research that represented decades of careful work. They had given up everything to expose the hegemony's crimes, and now they were stranded on a lifeless planet with no hope of completing their mission. But instead of despair, Marcus saw determination. They were already making plans to continue their research, even from exile. "There are ruins on the fourth planet," Soleil reported during their evening briefing. "Pre-contact structures possibly several thousand years old. If we can establish a permanent base here, we could study them properly. Assuming we survive long enough," Darmoth added pessimistically. The communications specialist had been monitoring galactic news feeds, and the reports were not encouraging. The hegemony had officially branded them as terrorists and was offering substantial rewards for information leading to their capture. Marcus looked around at the group gathered in the Wanderer's Rest's common area. 6 beings from 4 different worlds, all of them technically dead according to their own governments. They should have been broken by the experience, but instead they were talking about ancient ruins and research opportunities. "What if we made this permanent?" Marcus said suddenly. The conversation stopped. Zaratel turned to him with the kind of careful attention that meant she was about to ask an important question. "What do you mean by permanent?" "I mean, what if we stopped thinking of this as temporary exile and started thinking of it as an opportunity?" Marcus gestured toward the viewports, where the crater's rim was visible against the alien stars. "We've got everything we need here. Raw materials, energy sources, defensible position. We could build something that actually matters." "Build what?" Kithara asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment, trying to put his half-formed thoughts into words. "A place where people can come when they have nowhere else to go. A safe harbor for refugees, for researchers, for anyone who doesn't fit into the galaxy's neat little categories." Christek's form chimed with what Marcus had learned was amusement. "You propose to establish a refuge for outcasts and misfits. The hegemony would consider such a place to be a criminal enterprise." "The hegemony considers us criminals already," Marcus pointed out. "At least this way we'd be doing something useful while we're at it." Wing singer Hakathale spoke in her musical voice. "This human sees possibility where others see only exile. There is wisdom in this perspective." Over the following weeks, the idea began to take shape. They would expand their temporary base into something permanent, not just a hiding place, but a functioning community that could support other refugees. Marcus had the technical skills and equipment to build the infrastructure. The Melodians had the diplomatic connections to spread word through unofficial channels. Christek could handle the complex calculations needed for advanced construction projects. Wing singer Hakathale's people were natural traders who could help establish supply lines. But they would need more than good intentions to make it work. They would need resources, personnel, and most importantly, they would need to prove that the concept could actually function. The test came sooner than expected. Marcus was working on the atmospheric processor when Darmoth's voice crackled through his helmet communicator. "Marcus, we have a situation. Unknown ship approaching from the outer system. Configuration suggests it's not hegemony." Marcus dropped his tools and headed for the communications array they'd set up on the crater rim. The approaching vessel was broadcasting a distress signal in what his computer identified as Zentaurian, one of the more aggressive species in this sector. They were known for their military prowess and their tendency to shoot first and ask questions later. "Can you get me a translation?" Marcus asked. "Working on it," Darmoth replied. A few minutes later, the alien's harmonic voice carried a note of urgency. "They're reporting catastrophic engine failure and life support issues, requesting immediate assistance." Marcus stared at the sensor readings. The Zentaurian ship was definitely in trouble. Its power signature was fluctuating wildly and it was leaking atmosphere, but Zentaurians were also notoriously xenophobic. There was a 50-50 chance that this was either a genuine emergency or an elaborate trap. "Captain," Zaratel said over the communication channel, "I should point out that Zentaurians and Melodians have been in a state of formal hostility for over 60 years. If we assist them, we may be placing ourselves in considerable danger." Marcus looked at his companions, realizing that this was the moment when their theoretical safe harbor became real. They could ignore the distress call and maintain their security, or they could take a risk and actually help someone in need. The choice would define what kind of place this was going to be. "Darmoth, open a channel to the Zentaurian ship," Marcus said. "Let them know we're responding to their distress call." "Marcus," Christek chimed in, "I feel obligated to point out that this course of action has a 73% probability of resulting in violence. Then we better make sure we're in the other 27%. He suited up and headed for the Wanderer's Rest, knowing that his decision might get them all killed, but unable to ignore someone in genuine need. The Zentaurian ship was a military corvette that had clearly seen better days. Its hull was scarred with weapon impacts, and several of its external systems had been destroyed by what looked like energy weapons. This wasn't just engine failure. Someone had shot these people up and left them to die. Marcus docked with the Corvette's emergency airlock and found himself face to face with the most dangerous-looking alien he'd ever encountered. The Zentaurian was 7 feet tall, covered in natural armor plates, and equipped with enough built-in weapons to level a city block. He was also bleeding from several wounds and swaying on his feet from exhaustion. "Human," the Zentaurian growled, his voice like grinding stone. "I am Commander Thraxon of the Ironclad Brotherhood. We require assistance." The way he said require made it clear that asking for help was probably the most humiliating thing that had ever happened to him. Marcus had heard about Zentaurian pride. They would rather die than appear weak in front of other species. "Commander Thraxon," Marcus replied carefully. "I'm Marcus Chen. Let's get you and your crew somewhere safe, and then we can figure out how to fix your ship." "My crew is dead," Thraxon said bluntly. "Pirates. The Verthan Syndicate. They wanted our cargo. We disagreed." Marcus looked past the commander into the ship's interior. The corridors were dark and silent, with the unmistakable signs of combat, burns on the walls, debris scattered across the floor, and the kind of stillness that meant no one was coming home. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, meaning it. Thraxon's armored head tilted slightly, as if he hadn't expected sympathy from a human. "You offer assistance to someone who cannot repay you. This is unusual. It's what we do here," Marcus said, realizing as he spoke that he was already thinking of this place as a permanent home. "Come on, let's get you patched up." Bringing a 7-foot-tall Zentaurian warrior back to their base caused exactly the kind of tension Marcus had expected. Zarathel and her crew were visibly nervous. Their species had been enemies for generations, and cultural programming was hard to overcome. Thraxon, for his part, seemed to expect treachery at any moment, but necessity created strange alliances. Thraxon's injuries were severe enough that he needed immediate medical attention, and the Melodians were the only ones present with advanced healing technology. Zarathel found herself working alongside a member of the species she'd been taught to fear, while Thraxon was forced to trust his life to people he considered enemies. The ice began to break when wing singer Hakathale offered the injured Zentaurian some of her people's ceremonial healing songs. The musical frequencies actually had measurable therapeutic effects on Zentaurian physiology, something that surprised everyone present, including Hakathale herself.
"Your voice brings peace," Thraxon admitted grudgingly.
"This is not a thing I expected to experience in this life. Music transcends the boundaries that divide us," Hakathale replied. "Perhaps that is why the universe gave us different voices, so that we might learn to sing together." Over the following days, as Thraxon recovered from his injuries, Marcus began to see the potential of what they were building. The Zentaurian warrior brought military expertise and knowledge of pirate activities in the Outer Rim. Zarathel's team contributed scientific knowledge and diplomatic skills. Marcus provided the technical foundation and manufacturing capability that held everything together. More importantly, they were proving that natural enemies could work together when they had a common purpose. The revelation that Melodian and Zentaurian physiologies were actually compatible in unexpected ways led to fascinating discussions about evolutionary convergence. Christek's analysis of the pirate attack yielded valuable intelligence about syndicate operations. Even Darmoth found that his communication skills were useful for mediating between species with radically different social structures. When Thraxon's ship was finally repaired, Marcus expected the Zentaurian to leave immediately. Instead, the warrior approached him with what Marcus was learning to recognize as a formal request. "Marcus Chen," Thraxon said, using the careful pronunciation that showed respect. "I wish to make a proposal. I'm listening. The Ironclad Brotherhood is no longer my home. My ship, my crew, my honor, all destroyed by pirates while the galactic authorities looked the other way. But here, in this place you are building, I see the possibility of honor restored." Marcus waited, sensing that interrupting would be a mistake. "I request permission to remain here." Thraxon continued, "To contribute my skills to this sanctuary you are creating. In return, I offer my protection and my knowledge of those who prey upon the innocent." It was the first time someone had asked to join their community, rather than simply accepting help. The significance wasn't lost on any of them. The commander, Zerathel, said formally, "The Melodian Collective has been at war with the Centaurian Empire for 3 generations. If you remain here, we will be forced to set aside centuries of hostility." "Captain," Thraxon replied, "if we can set aside centuries of hostility to build something better, perhaps that is exactly what this galaxy needs." Marcus looked around at the group that had somehow become his family. Refugees from a dozen worlds, representatives of species that had been fighting each other since before humanity reached the stars, all of them united by nothing more than a shared belief that things could be better. "Welcome to Haven's Rest," Marcus said, using the name for the first time and knowing it was right. "Let's see what we can build together." That night, as Marcus stood on the crater rim looking up at the alien stars, he realized that his promise to Sarah was finally taking shape. He was helping people, not just rescuing them, but giving them a place to belong. A place where the galaxy's outcasts could find purpose, where enemies could become friends, where the impossible could become inevitable. The hegemony would come for them eventually. Pirates would test their defenses. The galaxy would try to tear apart what they were building. But for the first time in 8 years, Marcus Chen wasn't running away from anything. He was building towards something better. Haven's Rest was no longer just an idea. It was home. 6 months after Thraxon's arrival, Haven's Rest had grown from a temporary refugee camp into something that resembled a small city. The crater that Marcus had chosen for their landing site now housed a complex network of interconnected buildings, workshops, and living quarters. What had started as desperate improvisation had evolved into careful urban planning with input from every species represented in their growing community. The Melodians had designed the residential areas according to harmonic principles that promoted psychological well-being. Christech had calculated optimal placement for industrial facilities to minimize environmental impact. Thraxon had positioned defensive installations with military precision. Wingsinger Hakethli had established a trading post that was already attracting merchants from neighboring systems. But it was Marcus who had built the heart of Haven's Rest, a massive workshop complex that could repair anything from personal communicators. The facility contained manufacturing equipment that rivaled military shipyards, powered by geothermal energy from the planet's core and staffed by specialists from a dozen different worlds. Word was spreading through unofficial channels. Ships arrived weekly now, some carrying refugees fleeing persecution, others bringing traders eager to do business away from the prying eyes of government regulators. A few came simply because they had heard rumors of a place where impossible problems got solved by a human who refused to accept that anything was truly beyond repair. The diversity was staggering. Marcus found himself working alongside Regilian quantum engineers, vegan biotechnicians, and Andromedan systems analysts. Species that had never spoken to each other were collaborating on projects that would have been impossible in the formal academic institutions of the core worlds. It was also attracting attention from less welcome sources. "Marcus, we need to talk." Darmoth's voice carried an urgency that made Marcus look up from the fusion reactor he was calibrating. The Melodian communication specialist had been monitoring galactic news networks, and his expression suggested the news wasn't good. "What's the situation?" Marcus asked, wiping his hands on a work cloth. "The hegemony has issued a formal notice to all member worlds," Darmoth said. "They're declaring Haven's Rest to be a rogue settlement in violation of galactic law. They're demanding that all legitimate governments refuse trade with us and deny us access to their territory." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. They had known this day would come, but he had hoped they would have more time to establish themselves before facing official opposition. "What's the specific charge?" he asked. Multiple violations, Darmoth read from his datapad. Operating outside territorial boundaries, harboring known criminals, engaging in unauthorized terraforming activities, and, this is the interesting part, conducting illegal research into restricted technologies. J6. Restricted technologies. Marcus had been careful to avoid anything that might be considered weapons development. Most of their research focused on propulsion systems, life support improvements, and industrial applications. Apparently, our work on universal translation matrices violates hegemony intellectual property claims, Darmoth explained. Also, our atmospheric processing techniques are classified as strategic resources. Marcus laughed bitterly. The hegemony was claiming ownership of technologies that had been independently developed by dozens of species over thousands of years. It was typical bureaucratic overreach, designed to justify whatever action they wanted to take. Any word on enforcement? He asked. Not yet. But intelligence suggests they're building a case for military intervention. The official justification would be protecting galactic stability from terrorist organizations. Marcus looked around at the workshop where Regellian engineers were teaching human apprentices advanced metallurgy techniques while a Zentorian weapons specialist helped a vegan pacifist design better medical scanners. If this was terrorism, the galaxy needed more of it. All a community meeting, Marcus said. Everyone needs to know what we're facing. The meeting took place in the main assembly hall, a circular amphitheater that Zaratel had designed according to Melodian acoustic principles. The space was packed with representatives from 37 different species, ranging from established refugees like Thraxon to recent arrivals who were still adjusting to life in a multi-species community. Marcus stood at the center of the amphitheater and looked up at the diverse crowd that had somehow become his responsibility. He had never intended to become a leader, but circumstances had forced the role upon him. Now he had to decide whether to fight for what they had built or find some way to compromise with powers that had no interest in compromise. By now, most of you have heard about the Hegemony's declaration, Marcus began. They're calling us criminals and threatening action against anyone who supports us. I want everyone to understand what this means, because some of you may decide that staying here isn't worth the risk. What kind of action? Called out Gentar, Arcturian trader who had arrived the previous week with a cargo hold full of refugees from a failed colony. Economic sanctions first, Marcus replied. No official trade relationships, no access to regulated shipping lanes, no diplomatic protection. After that, he shrugged. Military intervention isn't off the table. A ripple of concern ran through the crowd. Some species had experience with hegemony military action, and none of it was pleasant. Why? This came from Dr. Kesasara, a Polarian xenobiologist who had been exiled for refusing to hand over her research to military contractors. What threat do we represent to them? Marcus had been thinking about that question for weeks. Haven's Rest wasn't a military installation or a political organization. They weren't attempting to overthrow governments or establish territorial claims. They were simply providing services that the established powers preferred to control themselves. We represent proof that their system isn't necessary, he said finally. Every ship we repair, every refugee we help, every problem we solve, it's evidence that people can cooperate without governments telling them how to do it. Thraxon stood up, his massive form commanding immediate attention. The human speaks truth. The hegemony fears not our weapons, but our example. They have built their power on the belief that order requires control. We have proven that cooperation requires only goodwill. Goodwill doesn't stop military fleets, pointed out Sekan, a Talsician security specialist who had been helping to design their defensive systems. If they decide we're a genuine threat, we won't survive the first bombardment. Then we ensure that bombardment never comes, said a new voice from the entrance to the hall. Every head turned to see who had spoken. The newcomer was tall and elegant, with the distinctive bone ridges that marked him as Altarian nobility. His clothing was expensive, his bearing confident, and his presence in their humble assembly hall completely unexpected. Lord Vexani, Saratel said, rising from her seat with obvious surprise. "What brings the Altarian Trade Consortium to our remote settlement?" "Opportunity, Captain Zadatel," the nobleman replied smoothly, "and perhaps the chance to prevent a war that would benefit no one." Marcus studied the newcomer carefully. Altarians were known for their political sophistication and their talent for profitable neutrality. They had managed to maintain independence from all major powers through a combination of economic leverage and diplomatic finesse. If Lord Vexani was here, it meant Haven's Rest had attracted attention from some very powerful people. "Lord Vexani," Marcus said formally, "you're welcome here, but I should warn you that associating with us might damage your standing with the hegemony." "On the contrary, Mr. Chen," Vexani replied with a slight smile, "the hegemony needs what you've built here far more than they're willing to admit. The question is whether they can be made to see reason before pride forces them into a costly mistake." "What kind of mistake?" Darmoth asked. "The kind that starts with military action against a peaceful settlement and ends with half the galaxy questioning whether the hegemony has any legitimate authority at all," Vexani said. "The political ramifications of attacking Haven's Rest would be significant." Marcus began to understand what the Altarian was offering. Haven's Rest had become something more than just a refugee settlement. They were providing services that the established powers couldn't or wouldn't provide. Neutral ground for trade negotiations, technological innovation without political constraints, and safe harbor for people who didn't fit into conventional categories. "You're suggesting that we have more leverage than we realize," Marcus said. "Precisely. Your settlement has become essential to several ongoing diplomatic initiatives. The research being conducted here is crucial to multiple peacekeeping efforts. The refugees you've taken in include some of the galaxy's most brilliant minds." Vexani gestured toward the assembled crowd. "Destroying Haven's Rest would be an act of vandalism that would set back galactic progress by decades. But if they don't realize that," Sarathel began, "then it falls to those of us who do understand to help them see reason," Vexani finished. "The Altarian Consortium is prepared to offer formal recognition of Haven's Rest as an independent research station under our diplomatic protection." The implications of that offer sank in slowly. Altarian diplomatic protection was respected throughout the galaxy, and their trade networks were essential to interstellar commerce. The hegemony could pressure minor worlds to avoid Haven's Rest, but they couldn't afford to alienate the Altarian Consortium. "What would you want in return?" Marcus asked. "Because nothing in galactic politics came free." "Continued access to the innovations emerging from your workshops," Vexani said honestly. "Fair trading rights for Altarian merchants, and perhaps most importantly, a guarantee that Haven's Rest will remain politically neutral." It was a reasonable offer, probably more generous than anything they could have negotiated on their own. But Marcus found himself hesitating. Accepting Altarian protection would give them security, but it would also tie them to someone else's political agenda.
"I need to discuss this with my community," Marcus said finally.
"Of course. But I should mention that time is a factor," Vexani said. "My sources suggest that the hegemony is planning to move within the next few weeks. If we're going to prevent military action, we need to act quickly." After Vexani left to tour their facilities, Marcus found himself surrounded by urgent conversations in a dozen languages. The community was split between those who favored accepting the Altarian offer and those who preferred to maintain complete independence. "It's a trap," Thrakon said bluntly. "They offer protection today, control tomorrow. I have seen this pattern before. The alternative is facing the hegemony alone," Kristek pointed out, his crystalline form chiming with calculated concern. "Our defensive capabilities are impressive but not sufficient to repel a determined assault." "Perhaps there is a third option," Wingsinger Hakathalay suggested. "We could seek protection from multiple sources rather than relying on a single patron." Marcus spent the next 3 days considering their options while continuing to work on the infrastructure projects that kept Haven's Rest functioning. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was trying to decide the fate of a community he had never intended to create, using political skills he had never wanted to develop. The answer came to him while he was working on the atmospheric processor that supplied breathable air to the residential sectors. The system was a masterpiece of cooperative engineering, incorporating design elements from a dozen different species. No single culture could have created something so elegant and efficient, but together they had built something that served everyone's needs. That night, Marcus called another community meeting. "I've been thinking about Lord Vexani's offer," he began, "and I realized something. We're approaching this like we have to choose between independence and protection, but that's not really the choice we're facing." "What do you mean?" Dr. Kessera asked. "Haven's Rest isn't just a place," Marcus said. "It's an idea. The idea that people from different worlds can work together to solve problems that none of us could handle alone. The idea that cooperation is stronger than coercion." He gestured toward the assembled crowd. "Look around. 6 months ago, most of you had never heard of each other's species. Now you're building things together that are changing how the galaxy thinks about technology, medicine, and diplomacy." "Your point being?" Sekon asked impatiently. "My point is that we don't need to choose between one patron and another," Marcus said. "We need to make ourselves so useful to everyone that no one can afford to destroy us." Over the following weeks, Marcus put his plan into action. Instead of accepting exclusive protection from the Altarians, he negotiated partial agreements with multiple powers. The Regelian Republic agreed to sponsor their medical research. The Vegan Alliance endorsed their environmental initiatives. Even some of the minor human colonies offered quiet support for their technological innovations. Most importantly, Marcus opened their communications channels to anyone who needed help. Haven's Rest began providing free technical consultation to struggling colonies, mediation services for trade disputes, and research assistance for academic institutions. They became indispensable to so many different groups that threatening them would require facing a coalition of the galaxy's most influential organizations. When the Hegemony fleet finally arrived at NGC 4472, they found themselves facing not an isolated group of refugees, but a community that had become central to dozens of ongoing galactic initiatives. The political cost of military action had become too high to justify. The standoff lasted for 3 tense days, with hegemony ships positioned at the edge of the system while diplomats frantically negotiated behind the scenes. In the end, the fleet withdrew without firing a shot, leaving behind only a formal protest and a promise to monitor the situation. Standing on the crater rim, watching the last hegemony ship disappear into hyperspace, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. Victory. Not the kind that came from defeating enemies, but the kind that came from proving that there was a better way to solve problems. "It's not over," Zarathel said, joining him at the observation point. "They'll find other ways to pressure us." "I know," Marcus replied, "but we've proven something important. We've shown that cooperation can be stronger than coercion, that diversity can be more powerful than uniformity. And now?" Marcus looked out at the lights of Haven's Rest, spreading across the crater floor like a constellation of hope. Ships from 100 worlds were docked at their landing platforms. Workshops hummed with activity, as beings who had been enemies last year worked together on projects that would benefit them all. "Now we keep growing," he said. "Keep helping people, keep solving problems, keep proving that there's a better way to do things." Sarah would have been proud, Marcus thought. He had finally found a way to keep his promise, and in doing so, he had helped create something that was larger than any one person's dreams. Haven's Rest was no longer just a sanctuary for refugees. It was becoming the foundation for a new kind of galactic community, one built on cooperation rather than competition, on inclusion rather than exclusion, on the simple belief that everyone deserved a place to belong. The Tinkerer's promise was being kept, one small act of kindness at a time. 2 years had passed since the Hegemony fleet's withdrawal, and Haven's Rest had evolved into something that defied every conventional understanding of how galactic communities were supposed to function. The settlement now housed over 10,000 residents from 147 different species, making it one of the most diverse populations in known space. Marcus stood in the observation deck of the newly completed central spire, looking out over a community that had grown far beyond his wildest imagination. The original crater was now just the historic center of a sprawling complex that extended across several kilometers of the planet's surface. Residential districts specialized for different atmospheric requirements housed families from worlds where humans would die in minutes. Industrial sectors manufactured technology that combined the best innovations from dozens of cultures. Research facilities produced breakthroughs that were revolutionizing everything from faster-than-light travel to xenobiological medicine. But it was the social innovations that impressed Marcus the most. Heaven's Rest had somehow developed a system of governance that functioned without traditional hierarchies. Decisions were made through a complex process of consultation and consensus that incorporated the cultural values of every major species group. Conflicts were resolved through mediation rather than litigation. Economic activity operated on principles that prioritized community benefit over individual profit. It shouldn't have worked. Political scientists across the galaxy had written papers explaining why such a system was theoretically impossible. Yet here it was, not only functioning but thriving in ways that made conventional societies look primitive by comparison. Marcus. Zaratel's voice carried a note of concern that immediately got his attention. The Melodian captain had become his unofficial deputy, helping to coordinate the endless diplomatic challenges of managing a multi-species community. "What's the situation?" Marcus asked, turning away from the panoramic view. "We have a problem," Zaratel said, her harmonics carrying the subtle frequencies that indicated extreme urgency. "3 problems, actually, and they're all connected." Marcus followed her to the communications center, where Darmoth was monitoring data feeds from across the galaxy. The Melodian communications specialist looked more stressed than Marcus had ever seen him. "The first problem," Darmoth began without preamble, "is that someone has been spreading rumors about our research programs. Specifically, they're claiming that we're developing weapons technology in violation of galactic arms control treaties." "That's ridiculous," Marcus said. "Our research is completely open. Anyone can review our findings." "The second problem," Darmoth continued, "is that 3 separate terrorist attacks this month have been carried out using technology that's supposedly based on innovations from Haven's Rest. Modified fusion reactors, enhanced explosive devices, improved shield generators, all of it allegedly derived from our published research." Marcus felt a cold weight settling in his stomach. They had always published their findings openly, believing that shared knowledge would benefit everyone. The possibility that their work might be used for violence had always existed, but they had trusted that the benefits would outweigh the risks. "And the third problem?" he asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew. "The Galactic Security Council is meeting in emergency session to discuss what they're calling the Haven's Rest threat," Zarathel said. "They're considering a complete quarantine of our system with authorization to use military force if we refuse to comply." Marcus slumped into a chair, feeling the weight of unintended consequences. They had built something beautiful, something that worked, something that proved cooperation was stronger than competition. And now it was being used as justification for the very kind of violence they had tried to prevent. "How bad is it?" he asked. 37 worlds have already signed on to the quarantine proposal," Darmoth said, reading from his displays. "The hegemony is leading the initiative, but they have support from species that we considered allies." "Even the Regilians?" Marcus asked, thinking of the scientists who had been so enthusiastic about their collaborative research projects. "Especially the Regilians," Zaratel said sadly. "They're concerned that our technological innovations are giving smaller worlds too much military capability. They see us as destabilizing the balance of power." Marcus stared at the data flowing across Darmoth's screens. Intelligence reports, news feeds, diplomatic communications, all of it painting Haven's Rest as a threat to galactic security. The irony was bitter. They had become successful enough to be seen as dangerous by the very people they had been trying to help. "There's something else," Dartmouth said quietly. "Intelligence suggests that at least some of the terrorist attacks were false flag operations. The technology was deliberately designed to look like our innovations, but the actual construction methods are inconsistent with our published specifications." "Someone's framing us," Marcus said, though he wasn't surprised. They had made too many powerful enemies by proving that their way of doing things wasn't necessary. "The question," Saratel said, "is what we do about it." Marcus spent the next several hours reviewing the evidence, trying to understand how their dream had turned into a nightmare. The pattern was clear once he looked for it. Someone with significant resources and detailed knowledge of their research had orchestrated a campaign to discredit Haven's Rest. The terrorist attacks were just the beginning. The real goal was to justify the kind of military intervention that would destroy everything they had built. "We need to call a full assembly," Marcus said finally. "Everyone needs to understand what we're facing." The Great Assembly was a new tradition that had evolved over the past year, bringing together representatives from every major community in Haven's Rest to discuss issues that affected everyone. The session that evening was the largest ever held, with over 2,000 beings crowded into the central amphitheater. Marcus looked out over the diverse crowd and tried to find words that would explain how their greatest success had become their greatest vulnerability. Representatives from species that had been enemies for millennia sat together in harmony. Children from dozens of worlds played together in areas designed to accommodate radically different physiologies. Scientists shared knowledge that was advancing understanding across every field of inquiry. "By now, most of you have heard about the accusations being made against our community," Marcus began. "We're being blamed for terrorist attacks that we had nothing to do with, using technology that was supposedly derived from our research." A rumble of concern ran through the crowd. Many of these people had fled to Haven's Rest specifically to escape the kind of violence that was now being attributed to their work. "I want to be absolutely clear about something," Marcus continued. "The evidence suggests that we're being deliberately framed by groups that see our success as a threat to their power. The terrorist attacks were staged using technology designed to implicate us." "Why?" called out Dr. Kesara, the Polarian xenobiologist. "What do they gain by destroying us?" Marcus had been thinking about that question all day. "They gain proof that cooperation doesn't work, that diversity leads to chaos, that the only way to maintain order is through the kind of centralized control that they represent." "Trust, Teddy." Trust stood up, his massive form commanding attention. "If they seek to destroy us through violence, we should prepare for war." "No," Marcus said firmly. "That's exactly what they want us to do. The moment we militarize, we become the threat they claim we already are." "Then what do you propose?" This came from Lord Vexani, who had become a regular presence at community meetings despite his official duties with the Altarian Consortium. Marcus looked around at the crowd of beings who had somehow become his responsibility. People who had trusted him to build something better, something that would give them hope for a future that their children could be proud of. He couldn't let that trust be betrayed by fear or anger. "We do what we've always done," Marcus said. "We fix the problem." "How do you fix political conspiracy?" Sekan asked skeptically. "By proving that the conspiracy is unnecessary," Marcus replied. "By showing the galaxy that the things they're afraid of, that we're developing weapons, that we're destabilizing the balance of power, that we're training terrorists, are completely false." Over the following weeks, Marcus implemented a plan that was either brilliant or insane, depending on who was asked. Instead of retreating into defensive isolation, Haven's Rest opened its doors wider than ever before. They invited inspection teams from every major government, gave complete access to their research facilities, and broadcast live feeds from their laboratories, so that anyone in the galaxy could see exactly what they were working on. Most importantly, they shared everything. Every innovation, every breakthrough, every technical advancement was immediately published and distributed to anyone who wanted it. If their enemies claimed that Haven's Rest was hoarding dangerous technology, Marcus would prove them wrong by giving it all away. "This is madness," Krystek observed as Marcus uploaded their latest fusion reactor designs to the Galactic Information Network. "You are providing our innovations to the very people who seek to destroy us." "That's exactly the point," Marcus said. "If everyone has access to our technology, no one can claim that we're using it to gain unfair advantage." The strategy worked better than Marcus had dared to hope. Scientists from across the galaxy began arriving at Haven's Rest, not as inspectors or investigators, but as colleagues eager to collaborate on research projects. The open sharing of information created a cascade of new innovations as different species combined their knowledge in unprecedented ways. But it also created new problems. The flood of visitors strained their infrastructure. Cultural conflicts arose as beings from radically different backgrounds struggled to work together. Most seriously, the increased visibility attracted the attention of groups that saw Haven's Rest as either a valuable target or a dangerous example. The crisis came when a group of radical separatists attempted to seize control of the fusion research facility, claiming that humans were using alien technology to build weapons of mass destruction. The attack was repelled by the community's security forces, but not before several people were injured and significant damage was done to the laboratory. Marcus found himself standing in the wreckage of what had been their most advanced research center, looking at the destruction caused by the very kind of fear and hatred that Haven's Rest had been created to overcome. For the first time since Sarah's death, he wondered if he was fighting a losing battle against forces too powerful and too entrenched to defeat. "The damage is extensive," Kithara reported, her engineering assessment clinical but tinged with sadness. 3 months of work destroyed, possibly longer. "Equipment can be replaced," Marcus said automatically, though he wasn't sure he believed it anymore. "It's not about the equipment," Zaratel said quietly. "It's about what this represents. Despite everything we've done, everything we've proven, there are still people who would rather destroy than understand." Marcus looked around at the small group that had gathered in the ruined laboratory. The core community that had been with him since the beginning, the people who had believed in the possibility of something better when no one else would. They looked as discouraged as he felt. "Maybe they're right," Marcus said, voicing the doubt that had been growing in his mind. "Maybe this is too idealistic to work in the real galaxy. Maybe cooperation only functions on a small scale." Wing singer Hakufli spoke in her musical voice, the frequencies carrying harmonics of determination that Marcus hadn't heard before. "When the first seeds of my people's great forests were planted, many said they would never grow in our world's harsh soil. The soil was too acidic, the climate too cold, the native species too aggressive." She gestured toward the damaged laboratory. "But the seeds that grew despite the harsh conditions produced trees stronger than any that had come before. They changed the soil itself, made the climate gentler, turned aggressive species into partners." "Your point being?" Marcus asked. "My point is that the most important growth happens under the most difficult conditions," Hakathale replied. "This attack is not proof that our community is failing. It is proof that we are succeeding enough to be seen as a threat by those who profit from division." Marcus felt something stir in his chest, a spark of the hope that had driven him to build Haven's Rest in the first place. "You think we should rebuild? I think we should do more than rebuild," Thraxon said, his warrior's pragmatism cutting through the philosophical discussion. "I think we should expand." The idea that emerged from that conversation was audacious even by Haven's Rest standards. Instead of simply rebuilding their damaged facilities, they would create a network of similar communities throughout the galaxy. Each would be tailored to the specific needs of its local region, but all would share the same fundamental principles of cooperation and mutual aid. Haven's Rest was never supposed to be the only one, Marcus realized as they planned the expansion. It was supposed to be the proof of concept. The announcement of the Haven Project caused a sensation throughout the galaxy. Instead of one isolated community, they were proposing to create hundreds of similar settlements, each serving as a safe harbor for refugees and a center for collaborative research. The scale was unprecedented, the logistics were staggering, and the political implications were revolutionary. But perhaps most importantly, it captured the imagination of billions of beings who had grown tired of conflicts they didn't understand, fighting wars that served no one's interests but the powerful few who profited from them. Applications began flooding in from communities that wanted to become part of the network. Scientists, engineers, and social theorists volunteered to help design the new settlements. Even some governments began quietly offering support, recognizing that the Haven Project might offer solutions to problems they had been unable to solve through traditional means. Standing in the rebuilt laboratory 6 months later, watching teams of researchers from 40 different species work together on projects that would have been impossible anywhere else, Marcus felt the weight of his promise to Sarah finally beginning to lift. He had kept his word. He had found a way to help people, to build something better than what had come before. And now that something was growing beyond anything he had imagined possible. Heaven's Rest was no longer just a settlement or a research station or a refugee sanctuary. It was the foundation for a new kind of galactic civilization, one that proved cooperation was not just possible but inevitable when people were given the chance to choose understanding over fear. The Tinkerer's promise was becoming the galaxy's promise to itself. 10 years after Marcus Chen first pulled a damaged alien ship from an asteroid field, he stood before the Galactic Council as they debated the most significant political transformation in recorded history. The Great Assembly Hall on Nexus Prime had hosted countless diplomatic sessions over the centuries, but none had attempted to reshape the fundamental structure of galactic civilization itself. Marcus wore the simple work clothes that had become his trademark, looking distinctly out of place among the elaborate ceremonial garments and sophisticated technology that surrounded him. He carried only a datapad containing the proposal that had brought representatives from over 3,000 worlds to this moment. The Haven Accords represented 5 years of careful negotiation, compromise, and planning. If ratified, they would establish a new framework for interstellar relations based on the principles that had made Haven's Rest successful: voluntary cooperation, shared knowledge, and mutual aid rather than competition and coercion. "The motion before us today," announced Council Speaker Tuvalan, her Andorian features betraying no emotion, "is unprecedented in scope and implication. We are being asked to fundamentally alter the basis of galactic governance." Marcus had heard similar statements dozens of times over the past months. The Haven Project had grown beyond anyone's expectations, with over 200 active communities spanning 47 star systems. Each settlement operated on the same basic principles as the original Haven's Rest, but adapted to local conditions and cultures. The results had been remarkable: faster technological advancement, peaceful resolution of conflicts that had persisted for generations, and economic prosperity that didn't depend on exploitation of weaker worlds. But success had brought new challenges. The various Haven communities were beginning to function as an informal network that operated outside traditional governmental structures. They shared resources, coordinated research, and provided mutual defense without requiring oversight from established authorities. For many politicians, this represented an existential threat to their power. Ambassador Chen, Speaker Tovalan said, using the title that Marcus still found uncomfortable, "You may present your final arguments." Marcus stood and looked out over the assembly. Representatives from species that had been fighting each other for millennia sat in the same chamber, united at least in their curiosity about what he had to say. The irony wasn't lost on him. They had gathered in one of the galaxy's most formal political institutions to discuss the possibility of making such institutions largely unnecessary. "Honorable delegates," Marcus began, using the formal address that diplomacy required. 10 years ago, I was a failed salvage operator drifting between systems with no purpose beyond avoiding the mistakes that had destroyed my previous life. Today, I stand before you as proof that people can change, that communities can grow, and that cooperation can accomplish things that competition never could. He gestured toward a holographic display that showed the current Haven network: 217 communities, over 50 million residents from 1,400 different species, average quality of life indices that exceed any comparable population in known space, innovation rates that have accelerated galactic technological development by an estimated 300%. Impressive statistics, interrupted Senator Korax of the Hegemony delegation. But what you're proposing goes far beyond expanding your network. You're asking us to abandon governance structures that have maintained stability for thousands of years. Marcus had expected this objection. The Hegemony had been the most vocal opponent of the Haven Project, seeing it as a direct challenge to their authority. Senator Korax, I'm not asking anyone to abandon anything. The Haven Accords don't require existing governments to change their internal structures. We're simply proposing an alternative framework for interstellar relations. An alternative that makes traditional governments irrelevant, pointed out Councillor Zhang from the Terran Federation. Only if traditional governments choose to become irrelevant, Marcus replied. Haven communities don't exist to replace existing institutions. They exist to provide options for people who don't fit into those institutions. He activated another display, this one showing population flows between Haven communities and traditional worlds. Over the past 5 years, approximately 12 million beings have emigrated to Haven settlements. But nearly 8 million have returned to their homeworlds, carrying with them new skills, new perspectives, and new solutions to old problems. The data told a story that even Haven's critics had to acknowledge. The network was functioning as a kind of galactic university, providing education and experience that benefited everyone involved. People came to Haven communities to learn new technologies, develop innovative approaches to social problems, or simply experience life in a truly diverse environment. Many then returned home with knowledge that improved conditions for millions of others. The question before us today, Marcus continued, isn't whether the Haven Project should be allowed to continue. It's going to continue regardless of what this council decides. The question is whether we want to formalize the relationship between Haven communities and existing governments in a way that benefits everyone. Wing singer Hecathley stood in the observer section, her presence lending musical accompaniment to Marcus's words. She had become the unofficial cultural ambassador for the Haven Project, helping to negotiate the complex social protocols required to make diverse communities function. If I may, she said in her characteristic melodic voice, I would like to offer a perspective from someone who has lived in both traditional and Haven communities. Speaker Toval Ann nodded permission for her to continue. I was born on Harmony Prime, Hecathley said, a world governed by the kind of careful bureaucracy that ensures every decision is thoroughly analyzed before implementation. It took my people 17 years to approve a proposal for improved atmospheric processors. The same improvement was developed, tested, and implemented across 12 Haven communities in 8 months. This is not because Haven communities are reckless or poorly governed. It is because they don't require approval from authorities who must consider political implications before technical merit. When the goal is solving problems rather than maintaining power, solutions emerge much more quickly. And what happens when those solutions conflict with established policies? Asked Representative Maya Tell from the Vorthan Collective. Haven communities may be innovative, but they also operate outside regulatory frameworks that exist for good reasons. Marcus had anticipated this concern as well. Representative Maya Tell, the Haven Accords include comprehensive oversight mechanisms. Each community would operate under the supervision of an elected council that includes representatives from traditional governments. Any innovation that poses potential risks would be subject to review before implementation. But who would enforce such restrictions? Senator Korax demanded. Haven communities have consistently demonstrated that they consider themselves above traditional authority. We consider ourselves bound by different authority, Thraxon said, rising from his position in the observer section. The massive Zentorian warrior had become one of the most effective advocates for the Haven Project, his military background lending credibility to arguments about security and defense. The authority of mutual consent rather than hierarchical control, he continued. When people choose to cooperate because they see benefit in cooperation, enforcement becomes unnecessary. When people are forced to comply with rules they had no voice in creating, enforcement becomes the primary function of government. Marcus watched the faces of the assembled delegates as they absorbed Thraxon's words. Many of them were career politicians who had spent their lives navigating complex hierarchies and bureaucratic structures. The idea that governance could function without such systems was both fascinating and terrifying to them. "The truth is," Marcus said, returning to the podium, "we're not asking you to choose between the current system and the Haven alternative. We're asking you to recognize that both can coexist and that the galaxy is large enough for multiple approaches to governance." He activated a final display, this one showing projected outcomes under various implementation scenarios. If the Haven Accords are ratified, we estimate that within 20 years, the network would include over 1,000 communities serving more than 500 million residents. The economic benefits alone would justify the political risks. "And if they're not ratified?" asked Speaker Tovalan. "Then the Haven communities will continue growing without formal recognition," Marcus said honestly. "But the relationship between Haven settlements and traditional governments will remain undefined, creating the potential for conflicts that could have been avoided through clear agreements." The debate that followed lasted for 3 days. Representatives argued over jurisdiction, authority, economic implications, and security concerns. Some saw the Haven Project as the natural evolution of galactic civilization. Others viewed it as a dangerous experiment that threatened everything their ancestors had built. Marcus spent most of the debate period in the observer sections, watching democracy in action and marveling at how complicated people could make simple concepts. The basic idea behind the Haven Accords was straightforward: allow voluntary communities to operate alongside traditional governments while maintaining clear protocols for interaction and mutual support. But politics was never simple, and every delegate had constituencies to consider, allies to placate, and enemies to outmaneuver. What should have been a discussion about practical cooperation became a philosophical argument about the nature of authority and the purpose of government. On the final day of debate, Marcus was surprised to be approached by Senator Corax during a recess period. The hegemony representative had been one of the most vocal opponents of the Haven Project, arguing that it represented an unacceptable challenge to established order. "Ambassador Chen," Corax said formally, "I wonder if I might speak with you privately." Marcus followed the senator to a quiet corridor away from the main assembly hall. Corax was younger than Marcus had expected, probably in his early 40s by human standards, with the kind of intense intelligence that came from navigating complex political environments. "Senator," Marcus said, "I get the impression you have something specific on your mind." "I do," Corax replied. "I want to understand the Tinkerer's Promise, raising a safe harbor for lost starships and wandering aliens. Part 2, HFY.